Good evening, everyone. I know many of you here this evening, but not everyone. My name is Michael Selbst, and I am the president of the board of Hamilton Hall. Thank you so much for joining us for our annual Americana Lecture. All of you will go down in history as the very first attendees of Hamilton Hall's very first virtual lecture. This year, we are proud to present Untold African American Stories by biographer Adelaide Solomon Jordan. Adelaide is a Connecticut native. She spent childhood summers in the Massachusetts Berkshires. She was a history major at Virginia Union, which is an historically Black college, and she has a Bachelor of Science from Empire State College. She also holds a Master of Arts with a focus in biography from Goddard College. She is currently the Education Chair and on the board of the Holocaust and Human Rights Center of Maine. Adelaide is a biographer of the lives of ordinary New Englanders of the 18th and 19th centuries. Currently residing in Western Maine, Adelaide has a special interest in her maternal family, which dates to the early 1700s in Western Massachusetts. She is an honorary board member of the Dalton Historic Commission. Her research interest also includes her paternal ancestors of the Grand Cayman in the British West Indies. Adelaide, thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Oh, thank you for asking me. I'm honored to be this Americana Lecture speaker.
So a few housekeeping details before we begin. We'll start by showing a recording of Adelaide's lecture, and then we'll follow up with the Q&A. So please take note of the Q&A box located on your screen. It should be on the bottom right-hand corner next to the leave button, which of course you shouldn't press yet. So as you have questions as you're listening to Adelaide's lecture, please enter your questions there. I'll now pass us on to my friend and Vice President of the Board, Jeff Casiglia. After Adelaide's presentation, Jeff will be reading aloud your questions to Adelaide, and she'll respond. Jeff?
Hey, thanks, Michael, and thanks, everybody. We're really excited to have a record-setting number of you joining us tonight from across the country. We've looked into it, and I think we have people coming from as far away as Massachusetts to see this lecture. In the uncertain times that we have, we do feel fortunate enough to be able to change what's traditionally an in-person lecture with some local attendees to having a virtual lecture that's reaching all of you from coast to coast and outside the United States. So it's terrific for us. We have to thank our generous sponsors. The lecture would not be possible without East Boston Savings Bank, Salem Hillfest, Natalie Vinny, and some other anonymous donors that didn't want to be acknowledged but have made contributions to Americana and preservation at Hamilton. And the Hamilton Hall staff of Kate and Donna especially have really pulled out the stops to make this work. Ladies are terrific, and they deserve a thunderous round of cyber applause. I don't know, but they deserve all acknowledgement. They've been fabulous. But for now, we've got a story lined up for you that's better than any of those Hallmark holiday movies. And working with Adelaide has really challenged some of our presumptions about what African American history is in this country. So please do use the Q&A feature, as Michael said, to post some questions for Adelaide. She's been gracious enough to stay on for a bit after and answer some of our queries. We'll also monitor the chat for activity and see if we can find anything. So grab your favorite beverage, or, 3, you don't have to drive home. Isn't that great? Kick back and relax, and please enjoy Untold African American Stories.
I want to welcome you to what I hope will be an informative time together. I want to thank the board of Hamilton Hall for inviting me to be this year's Americana speaker. The story I'm going to tell would not be possible without 2 of my Saunders cousins, Betty Ann Townsend, who's in Bermuda, and George Ford Jr., who is in California. George is also a Remin descendant, the Remins of Hamilton Hall. Betty Ann in Bermuda was wondering what had happened to the family members that had come to the United States. She didn't know if there was anyone left, and she started a search. She found out that there were when her sister Marguerite saw my mother's obituary in the Berkshire Eagle, and that led her to me. George was trying to give his brother Gerald the gift of their New England ancestry, and he was doing research. Betty found him, and since that time, We've had family gatherings, which George named Saunders Summits, and they've taken place in Cambridge, Mass, in Atlanta, Georgia, in California, and Bermuda. I was researching the Percep and Hoos families in the Berkshires of Massachusetts, not knowing that there was anyone left in Bermuda. This is the story of three young women who permanently journeyed to the United States from Bermuda: Mary Elizabeth, Cara, and Nina Louise Saunders. While it's a personal family story, it is also the story of an African American experience in the United States. A little bit different story than we're usually hear. I want to start though by putting the Bermuda and Africa and America story in historical context. Both Bermuda and the United States have a long history of enslavement of people from Africa. We tend to think of Bermuda as the wedding destination place or the retirement trip after many years of work. But in fact, there are many parallels between enslavement and discrimination and segregation in Bermuda and in America. Even the timing of it. In Bermuda, the first Africans were brought there and enslaved in 1616. In the United States, many of us know, that happened in 1619. But this led me to the question of why would the sisters leave Bermuda and permanently come to the United States? Why would you leave this neighborhood? Why would you leave this home? Why would you leave this church? Our story of the sisters begins with the oldest daughter in the family, and that was Mary Elizabeth. In 1906, Mary Elizabeth came, and we know from that ship's manifest, as a maid to America. And her destination was listed as Pittsfield, Massachusetts. We don't know who she came to work for. We don't know where she lived. We don't know even when she went back to Bermuda, but she did. We do know that. And we know that because she returned again in 1908. But this time when she came back, she was a married woman of 19 years old. Her marriage to 21-year-old Earl Percep of Pittsfield, Mass, had been approved by her mother, Mary Davis Saunders, and witnessed by her older brother, Alpheus, and her sister, Cara. Now, when you do biography, you pick up factual information such as the ship's manifest or christening certificates or birth certificates or marriage certificates, all of which we have for this young family. But how did they get together? And so the story that I've created is that while Mary Elizabeth was in Pittsfield, Massachusetts in the 1906 trip, she was spotted by Earl Percep, and he was smitten. Now we know that he worked as a cook. And so the story I've created says that he worked his way over as a cook on a ship to Bermuda. And when they sailed back in 1908 from Bermuda, they didn't come alone. They had their newly christened 11-month-old baby girl, Florence Lucretia Percep, with them. And there they are on the manifest, and there is Florence Lucretia. When I was looking, my mother and I were looking through some pictures, and I said to her, did they take, no, she said, did they take, they took that picture when I got off the boat. And I said, they took that picture at Ellis Island? And she said, no, they took it in Pittsfield. But she knew that that was her baby picture. And I knew from the manifest that she was 11 months old. Okay. And here are two classic pictures of Florence Lucretia's parents. that she came over with. On, on the left is her mother, Mary Elizabeth, and on the right is her father, Earl Percep. She's standing in front of her Boston house, and he is in his magic regalia. He did magic both as a vocation and an avocation. And you can see all of his magic uh, supplies that he needed and used. Uh, but there was something that definitely put Florence Lucretia and her parents right dead in the middle of American history. When I was about 16 years old, my mother told me, that's Florence Lucretia, that Nana always said Mark Twain fed me on the boat coming over. And I remembered that story for decades. And lo and behold, when it was time to be able to find a manifest, ellisisland.com, there was Samuel Clemens, Mark Twain, on that same ship. So I guess I can say Nana always said Mark Twain fed me on the boat coming over. And for my mother, that was absolutely a probability. The other part of verifying that is an interview that was done with Mark Twain by the New York Times, so that we know what the ocean was like. He characterized it as most rude. So to be able to know that from a 1908 voyage is pretty exciting. On the ship, they also brought lilies for Easter, 60,000 of them in 1,000 boxes. So it's quite a story there about Florence Lucretia's trip to the United States and her mother coming to live here and her dad. Now, Earl Percep, her father, and Mary Elizabeth's husband came from a very well-known and large family. And his mother, Alice Hamilton Percep, had been widowed very young. This is a picture of her at her 90th birthday with all those sons. Earl is not in this picture. I'm not sure where he was, but what is in this picture is young men who represented the accomplishments. And foremost for this family, it was about community service. Beginning with Earl and these other young men, their second great grandfather did 2 terms of service in the American Revolution. There was service in World War I by 2 of his brothers, Alfred, who was the first colored man to volunteer for the service in Berkshire County, and Charles, for whom the Percep American Legion is named. It's the Charles Percep Post 68. One of the things I remember from being in Pittsfield in the summer, the family played Pacino a lot. And they'd get around the dining room table ready to play, and somebody would say, "Where's Charlie?" And the answer was always the same: he's with his wife. Well, Uncle Charlie didn't have a wife. What he did have was the American Legion, and that's who he was married to. So it makes sense that the American Legion Post in Pittsfield is named in his honor. But there's also a park, Percep Park, and it is on the main street in Pittsfield, North Street, and there's a monument in it which extols the family virtues, again, of community service. So what was Mary Elizabeth doing all this time? Well, she and one of her sister-in-laws didn't attend the family First Baptist Church. They attended a Black church, Second Congregational. I think this was her independent streak, and also probably because that's what she was used to in Bermuda. Florence Lucretia played the piano there, and the son of that sister-in-law taught Sunday school there. This, of course, is more American history. Second Congregational Church was pastored by Reverend Dr. Thomas Nelson Baker. Dr. Baker is the only known formerly enslaved person to have earned a PhD from Yale University. He also attended and graduated in the first class from D.L. Moody School, Mount Hermon in Northfield, Massachusetts. We now know it as Northfield Mount Hermon School. And it would be attended by a number of Saunders related family members, including her great niece, the late Natalie Cole. It was also attended by Natalie's twin sisters and my sons. So it's what I call our family boarding school. This is a picture of in front of 242 Pomeroy Avenue in Pittsfield, where family still lives. On the left is a younger picture of Grandma Percep, Mary Louise's mother-in-law. Her husband is standing next to her, and in front of them is his father and her mother. Grandma Percep was a Hoos by her mother. And this is our connection to enslavement. Philip Hoos escaped from New York to Massachusetts, and he married Hannah Percep. But his owner came after him. And when he did around 1800, the good folks of Lanesboro, Massachusetts, told him to go away. That's Hannah's husband. I think he probably didn't feel terribly secure living that close to the Massachusetts border. And so he moved his family to Dalton, Mass, not that far away. And some years later, his grandson, Charles Hoos, at 19 years old, and already having started a family, purchased a house in what today we would call the Black neighborhood. There were 9 houses. They were very similar. And he purchased that house in 1868. Family lived in that house until 2001. And you can see here a picture of Charles Hoos and his 3 children. His wife passed away, unfortunately, with the birth of the little girl. But this is the house. On the sign, it says Fitch Hoos House. Well, Mr. Fitch also had been enslaved, and he had gotten to Massachusetts from Connecticut. He didn't own the house very long. It was built in 1848, but it was purchased in 1868 by Charles Hoos. And the historical commission, that the town of Dalton took the house over in 2004, and they were going to tear it down, which is what had happened to the other 8 houses. And there were people on the Dalton Historical Commission who actually went to school with and remembered some of the Hooses, because as I said, family lived in it until 2001. And they said, no, we need to save this house. And they set about doing that. It is now on the National Register of Historic Places. And in 2019, it received from the Massachusetts Historical Commission the Rehabilitation and Restoration Award. Next slide. And that is Mary Elizabeth's American Story. The next sister to come over to the United States permanently was Cara. She was 20 years old when she came over, and she did the same thing that her other sister, Nina Louise, did, which was came over, met someone, got married, and started a family. She had 3 daughters, Charlotte, Marie, and Cairo. Unfortunately, with the birth of Cairo, she passed away shortly thereafter. And there was her husband, Mingo Hawkins, with 3 girls to raise. Well, his sister, Lottie, and she had changed her name to Charlotte. One would think that it would be from Charlotte to Lottie, but in this case, it was from Lottie to Charlotte. And by this time, she was Dr. Charlotte Hawkins Brown, and Aunt Lottie had quite a national and even international reputation as an educator. she'd been born in the South, so she knew what life was like down there, and she felt like education was what she could do something about. She'd started college in Massachusetts, and she met Alice Freeman Palmer. So if you're familiar with Wellesley College, you know that Alice Freeman Palmer was the second woman head of that college. And Alice Freeman Palmer became a mentor and also a benefactor to Aunt Lottie. And this is how we have Palmer Memorial Institute. She named it in her honor. The building on the right is the Alice Freeman Palmer building. And as you can tell from the pictures, it was quite a substantial school. It is now a conference center. It was open from 1902 to 1971. These are some more buildings at Palmer. And Alice Freeman Palmer was quite the benefactor and support for Dr. Charlotte Hawkins Brown. Mingo sent the girls down to live with his sister, and they lived with her and of course, went to Palmer. Charlotte, the oldest one, Aunt Lottie decided needed a little bit more time in high school before she went off to college. And she sent her up to Northfield Seminary, that Northfield Mount Hermon. And she spent the year of 1938 at Northfield. Marie was more interested in the entertainment field, and she ended up singing in Duke Ellington's band and meeting along the way Nathaniel Cole, Nat King Cole, and she became Mrs. Nat King Cole and the mother of the late Natalie Cole. So now we have, for our two sisters, we have history with Mark Twain, we have education and culture with K. Rose Heritage, and that is her story. The last sister to come over was Nina Louise. Nina Louise came over, and just as Kara, she met someone and she married and started a family. She married George Lee, and they had 8 children. One of them passed away at age 14. We're not sure why, but his name is significant. It was pronounced Remin to our hearing, but it was really the same name of that family that we know at Hamilton Hall, the Remins. And we didn't know where he was buried. And so when we went to the cemetery in Cambridge, Massachusetts, we were very pleased to see that when he had died at the age 14, he was now with his older sister, Nina Taub, and his parents, George Lee and Nina Louise Lee. Now, Dr. Donna Seegers of Salem State University has devoted her research energies and time to the story of the Remins of Hamilton Hall. And we're going to give you the website for learning more about them. I would never be able to do justice to it. So it is Dr. Seeger's work that you need to look to. And also to the story of Sarah Parker Remin and a newly created studentship, they call it in England. She had gone to England to lecture on abolition. She ended up going to nursing school there, and she ended up becoming an obstetrician. She married and never returned to the United States. And now tribute is being paid to her through this studentship. So what happens today when we meet as Saunders at our Saunders summits? People have traveled across country by train together. They've met on a ship to cruise to Bermuda. And recently we celebrated the 75th birthday of one Sanders descendant, on Zoom, including Sanders' relatives from the Bahamas, from California, from Bermuda, from Maine, from Massachusetts. And that is our family tree. So here we are. I've talked about this family that was in beautiful Bermuda, the wedding destination place, the vacation place. And they came to Western Massachusetts. And instead of walking down pink sandy beaches, they are walking through the snow. This is along the side of whose house, by the way. And they didn't just come here. They married, they had children, they became naturalized citizens of the country, and they are absolutely part of our American history and certainly part of our African American history.
Well, thanks so much, Adelaide. It's really interesting to hear those different stories and the different perspectives. I think one of the questions I think that jumps out at a lot of us is why, especially with your picture of the snow, why did they pick Massachusetts rather than like, some of these other major immigration points or going in through Ellis and, heading maybe south where they're maybe more used to the climate or maybe more familiar to them.
Well, it gets even worse. um, the family included Dad Alpheus, Mother Mary Susan Davis Saunders, and there were 3 boys and 3 girls. I talked about the 3 girls. 2 of the boys came over also. The only one that didn't come over was married and had a very good job. And I'm thinking perhaps that's why he didn't come over. When Mary Susan was widowed, she also came over and also became a naturalized citizen. And all of this happened in terms of the coming over part by 1920. I think maybe when somehow when Mary Louise came over that first time, even though she went back, she came over again in 1908. And I think that was some sort of a good omen for the family. We don't know any particular reason that they had to leave Bermuda, but they certainly came to the United States. Now you saw Mary Elizabeth standing in front of her Boston home. Family still lives in that. And the picture with all the heads in it of all the descendants, that was in Alpheus's home. So these 2 family homes have been owned for decades. And I have no specific reason or idea why, but I think it probably started with something about Mary Elizabeth coming. She was the oldest daughter and finding a life here, and everyone followed, including her mom.
Well, someone had asked how far you can trace the family history back in Bermuda.
We have not gotten back. My personal goal in doing the family part of things is to get back to the enslavement part, and we did that with the marriage of a Percep to a Hoos, but we haven't been able to do that with the Saunders. We have some questions about whether or not one of Saunders, we've gone back a couple of generations beyond the Alpheus that came here, if that was a white person, but we haven't been able to trace the slave part back there. And with the Percep family, we've gone back to the 1730s and we can't seem to break through with that very interesting name Percep. We can't seem to break through.
I mean, it is interesting. I mean, I think one of the things that we learned from you when we were, doing rehearsals and speaking is that I think one of the major perceptions that people have is that most African Americans that are here are just immediately descended from slaves, and that's how they came to this country. And that, but you've taught us really that some of them immigrated on their own under their own circumstances that has no connection to slavery. But going back, as you said, to the Perceps and their connection to slavery, but they also have that the military service. And I think one of the questions someone raised was, where do they feel that loyalty to the country if they were possibly coming out of enslavement, but then they wanted to dedicate their lives and put their life on the line for the country?
Well, my personal area of study is early New England African Americans. I'm the biographer for a Revolutionary War soldier named Pomp Russell from Western Maine. We know usually the figure we see is 5,000 African descent men, although I'm sure there were some women in there, fought in the Revolutionary War. But more realistically, it was probably more like 10,000. And we can go back to an ancestor that served 2 terms. Now, 2 terms meant serving in the military back then meant you planted the crop and then you went off and served. And then when it was time to harvest the crop, you came back home, harvest the crop, and you went back again. So serve a term might be just a few months at a time. And we're able to go back, like I said, with the Perceps to 1730. And then
Wow.
we run into a block.
Well, someone's asked about, in terms of being in Western Mass, they wondered if being in Western Mass was somewhat, if they felt safer living there in the Berkshires, just because it was different. That was a question someone had posed. And someone else had made a point of saying it seemed interesting that the churches seemed integrated, perhaps earlier. They got the impression that the churches maybe were integrated earlier than the rest of the country from some of the images you had showed.
The interesting thing about Second Congregational Church is that Thomas Nelson Baker was the second pastor, and the first pastor was Harrison was his name. He was originally from Philadelphia, and he was the chaplain for the 54th and 55th, which were the Negro troops. He left the pastorate of the church to do that. And Thomas Nelson Baker took over pastoring that church. And I talk about him, and what I didn't mention is that one of his sons married into the Percep family. So there are a lot of connections that go there, but there were Black churches, and they also served as a way that people were able to escape from enslavement. The community in Dalton, where Whose House is also considered to probably have been a part of the Underground Railroad. And that would have preceded Charles House owning it, since he didn't buy it until 1868, but the house was built in 1848. So it's likely that that is true.
We have another question asking about how far back, or do we know about any Remins still living in Bermuda?
About?
The Remins living in Bermuda.
Now that I really want to encourage people to read the material that is on the Hamilton Hall website that Dr. Seegers has done. That is just an incredible story about starts out with a 12-year-old boy coming over to the United States. And that is a story you will have to take an afternoon and read about. But that
other people, I'm sorry, please.
That goes back well into the 1800s in terms of the time that they were living there. Mm-hmm.
So speaking of the Whose House, there's some interest, people, and I don't know if the attendees are aware, but we are donating portions of the proceeds to preservation for the Who's House.
Yes.
People are asking about preservation of the Who's House and what has been done for
About the
how that
preservation.
project has been. Sure.
Whose House, I think that was it was a labor of love for the people that were involved in it. I got involved after they were deeply involved in it, and I could see how committed they personally were. And it had a lot to do with their having known people that lived in the house. One of the things that you may have noticed about the house is, how did they heat it? There's no indication. At the award ceremony, I sat next to the architect, and of course, these were all preservation architects and folks that worked on the house. And she asked me, because she said they had not been able to find out how the house was heated. There is so much original about that house in terms of its structure. It really is amazing. It is a museum, so it is open from May to October generally. We're in a different time right now, but it is open for school children to come. They also go out and do information sessions, and they'll go to a retirement community, and there will be people there that knew the Hooses, so they're able to get more stories about the house. But it is a little tiny house, but it is worth, if you're in the area, I really encourage you to go by Who's House.
Well, there's a lot of interest in that. People are asking, people are saying how many, when the Percep Saunders came to Western Mass, what was the African-American population in that area? And another person had asked, from Western Mass, were there a great many slaves that had served in the Revolutionary War, since it wasn't heavily populated?
Well, in terms of there were several units of African Americans that served. Usually we know about the 54th, the 55th, and there was at least one other unit. Sometimes those people came from other places and became part of those units by coming to Massachusetts. They specifically came to do that. But the number of the total of men who served during the Revolutionary War of African descent is probably around 10,000. But if you look in a book, you're going to see 5,000, you might see 6,000. But in talking with Hollis Gentry, who is now at the Smithsonian African American Museum, but at the time that she and I worked together, she was with the Daughters of the American Revolution, specifically compiling that information. And she told me that was at least 10,000. I don't know how many from the Berkshires.
People want to know more about your mother and the house in Boston.
About my mother and the
house in Boston?
Oh, the house in Boston. That is my grandmother's house. At some point, she made a decision to leave Pittsfield and came to Boston and purchased that home and lived there. And her youngest daughter and her husband lived there, and now their children live there. So it's in an area that is, I think the word gentrified could be used. It was a Black neighborhood when I was a child, and we would go there to visit in sometime in the summer. And so most of the houses have been turned into condominiums, so they're multifamily dwellings now, but that is still a single family house.
Wow.
As is the one in Cambridge. Alpheus's house is about a pebbles throw away from Harvard. And Nina Louise and Kara's both lived in the immediate area. So they lived near each other in terms of the folks that lived in Cambridge.
What part of Boston is the house?
It's on West Springfield Street. It's a 1-block street. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
It's a 1-block street. That's great. Okay.
I wanted to mention something else about Northfield Mount Hermon. I talk about uh, Charlotte having gone there, Cairo's daughter having gone there for 1 year. But before she went in 1938, Grandma Percep had sent her youngest child there. That would have been Mary Louise's brother-in-law, Donald. He went there in 1921, and that is another kind of unique situation for African-American children to be going to New England boarding schools. I have his archival folder from the school, and they were a little reluctant to give it to me because circled up at the top, it said colored. And Grandma Percep had to write twice for an application. And Thomas Nelson Baker wrote a recommendation for Donald to go there because he had been affiliated with the school and he was a very prominent minister in Pittsfield. And so Grandma Percep had him write a letter of recommendation for her youngest son. So our heritage starts in a New England boarding school in 1921. Another oddity.
Now, was there scholarship offered, or was it, I mean, or did they end up, I mean, boarding schools are not known as cheap, so were they
No,
paid full freight, or?
when Thomas Nelson Baker went there, he was sponsored by the chaplain of Williams College, and the chaplain paid half of his fee and the school absorbed the other half. And the chaplain paid $50 for a year.
It's a little bit better bargain than we get these days, huh? Okay. People wanted to know, someone is asking, what kind of sources can you recommend for looking at Revolutionary War service to find more people of color, Revolutionary War soldiers, sailors, those kinds of records, that kind of thing? What's a resource that someone might be able to use?
Well, there is a book by, can you see me trying to remember his name? But if you're Googling up, just Google that up. I can't think of the name of the author right now, but it is a book about a listing of the soldiers that served. It's upstairs in my house. But if you look up Revolutionary War African-American soldiers, you will find quite a bit to look at. The one book I'm trying to think of, the author's last name is Nell, Nell, I believe I have that right. The thing about looking for anything to do with African-American history is it is there. When I do workshops for teachers, what I tell them is whatever the topic is that you're going to be working with the children on, if you type in the topic and then put comma African-American, you will get something. No matter what your topic is, just put comma African-American.
Well, Donna has actually put the link here in the chat for people who are interested. And someone had mentioned maybe the name William Cooper Nell. William Cooper Nell, would that be the author?
Yes, I think that is correct.
Attendees to the rescue. See, when you've got
yes,
pulling
yes.
from as far as we can, they know everything.
Yes,
So someone also says there's in the Daughters of the American Revolution of 2 volumes called Forgotten Patriots.
Yeah, and that Forgotten Patriots one, they have Pomp Russell in there, and they say that he's buried in this is what happens. They say he's buried in Wells, Maine, Wells. Wells is a very popular summer vacation place in Maine. He is buried in a little tiny town of 200 people called Weld, W-E-L-D, Maine. I've been to his grave a few times. So I don't consider that an author error. I consider that an editing error. Somebody said, "Ooh, they meant to say Wells."
Another great question. people want to know if one attendee is asking, are Ramond and Saunders family in the African American Museum of the Smithsonian? Do
African
you know
American.
if at the Smithsonian, if the Ramond and Saunders families are featured in the African American parts of the Smithsonian?
Not that I know of. The thing about the Remin family is that it is not nearly presented as much as it should be. We keep going back to the same, what I call the usuals. And in terms of looking at abolition, we need to look to them. We need to look to the fact that they moved away from Salem because what their girls were not allowed into the high school because they were Black. Sarah Parker Remin went to England to lecture on anti-slavery issues and on abolition. She was able, while she was there, to get nurses training. She ended up as an obstetrician because she became a doctor. In Italy, she married an Italian man, and the hospital that she worked at has a plaque outside of the hospital. So anyone who's looking for an incredibly interesting topic, Women's History Month, or maybe one of those other months, Sarah Parker Remin would absolutely be someone to have to refer to someone to research, because her life went from Salem, Massachusetts, to England to Italy, and she became an obstetrician.
So someone has also asked, which I think if you can give a short primer for people, this is tying in. Well, I'm going to ask you a big question. Someone's saying, can you talk about how important it is to teach and know this African American history in the current moment? And one of the things I'll ask for you, and I know we've pointed the stuff out that Dr. Seeger has done, but in a nutshell, can you give people a kind of, who may not know, a smattering of just the scope of what the Remins did coming out of Hamilton, which is, our direct connection. I mean, you mentioned Sarah going to Italy, but they all were tremendously successful in so many different ways, and people may not be aware of that.
They were business people, and they did catering at the hall, but they also had businesses away from there. They one of the things that a lot of Black people did, was they were wig makers or hairdressers. So they were extremely entrepreneurial in their efforts. And which is why it's kind of sad that we don't know more about them, because they were in a situation, and it's almost like they looked around and said, what's needed? and they fulfill those. A high school student did some translating of the minutes, some subscribing of the minutes of their annual meetings for Hamilton Hall. And one of the things that was discovered is that one year, one of the Remins ran the annual meeting, and that was incredibly exciting to think that they allowed this Black man to run the annual meeting.
Wow.
We would not normally think that that would be something that a Black person would be allowed to do. But the reality is he knew everything that had happened. And so it just kind of made sense. We don't know how he ended up doing that year, but he did. The archival minutes, that is something that you can go on the Hamilton Hall site and be able to look at, because a high school student worked on those. Now, she worked on those with a Remin descendant, George Ford.
Another attendee is pointing out that if you are one of our locals in Mass, you can come to Peabody, Essex, and we have letters and works associated with the Remins up for at least another year, she says. So,
Yeah.
Okay. Michael,
I also want to point out that also a high school student, can you see me? Am I
Yes,
speaking?
you
Am I
can.
seeing- Okay. I also want to point out that there is a wonderful high school student that has taken some of the old Remin recipes and tried to reverse engineer them. Super wonderful, lovely, nerdy high school kid stuff. Fantastic stuff. And he's so into it as he explains it. And that's also available on the Hamilton Hall website, I believe. Super fun stuff. So Adelaide, thank you so very much for sharing your family stories, histories, and marvelous insights. The Q&A was utterly fascinating as well. Thank you very, very much. I do want to let folks know that Hamilton Hall will be continuing its 75-year tradition, and we will be presenting the lecture series on world affairs this February and March. For 3/4 of a century, the series has presented thought-provoking insights from illustrious speakers. And while the format may be different this year, it'll be virtual, of course, the opportunity for education and reflection has not changed. Previous speakers have included presidential advisors, former CIA agents, foreign ambassadors, and renowned academics. Information about the 2021 lineup can be found on our website. And one last thing before you go, if you don't mind sharing some feedback, in a moment, a prompt will pop up on the screen. Again, I just want to say thank you so very much, Adelaide, for your engaging manner and your interesting stories and your research. Thank you very much.
Bravo. Thank you so much.
Hope everyone has a lovely evening.
Thanks.
Take care.